The Land That Defied Belief, a Yellowstone Saga. If the history of America is the story of ambition and discovery, then Yellowstone is its untamed, beating heart. A place where the very ground hisses and boils. A landscape that literally had to be invented as a concept because no one could believe it existed. It is the only place in the United States where you can look down and realize you are standing on the lid of a supervolcano. And the most dangerous thing around might be the spectacular plumbing system beneath your feet. Before it was a destination, it was a rumor. Before it was a national park, it was simply impossible. This is the story of the land that challenged science, broke the spirit of frontiersmen, and gave birth to the global conservation movement. This is the saga of Yellowstone, from fire and ice to the traffic jams of summer. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Fire and Ice. Deep Time Before History. The story of Yellowstone does not begin with a map or a treaty. It begins with a cataclysm. Millions of years ago, a massive plume of magma, a geological hotspot, began to rise beneath the North American tectonic plate. The plate slowly drifted southwest over this persistent plume, leading to a series of monstrous eruptions that dwarfs anything in human history. The three most recent devastating events, 2.1 million, 1.3 million, and 640,000 years ago, created the massive, bowl-shaped depression we now call the Yellowstone caldera. It's an area roughly 45 by 30 miles, an elliptical crater that is essentially the collapsed roof of the magma chamber. The heat from this still active magmatic system is the engine that powers the park's impossible features. Rain and snowmelt seep down through cracks and are superheated by the magma, creating a pressurized system. When the water finds an escape route, often through a system lined with silica, the mineral geyserite, the result is an eruption, a geyser. The colorful, bubbling mud pots and prismatic hot springs, like the breathtaking Grand Prismatic Spring, are the side effects of this eternal underground furnace. For thousands of years after the last major ice age scoured the landscape and carved out the canyons and riverbeds, people arrived. Archaeological evidence suggests Paleo-Indians were using the area's obsidian for tools and weapons as early as 11,000 years ago. The indigenous peoples, including the Shoshone, Crow, Blackfeet, Bannock, and Nez Perce, didn't see the park as a collection of tourist sites. They saw it as a sacred and functional homeland. They utilized the geothermal areas for warmth and cooking and hunted the vast herds of bison and elk. They were the first true stewards of this strange land, moving with the seasons and treating the geysers with appropriate respect and caution. They were the first to know the land, but their knowledge was largely ignored when the next wave of visitors arrived. Chapter 2. The Rumors and the Rendezvous, 1800 to 1870. The Lewis and Clark expedition skirted the area in 1805 to 1806, hearing only vague, unsettling tales from Native American tribes about the river that smoked. The first white American known to venture into the region was John Colter, a member of that expedition who later became a fur trapper. Sometime around 1807 to 1808, he traveled through the area, reportedly seeing evidence of the geysers. When he returned with tales of fire and brimstone, boiling springs, and mud that belched steam, he was not celebrated. He was ridiculed. People called his descriptions Colter's hell. For the next 50 years, the area was the domain of the mountain men, the fur trappers and traders. These men, famous for tall tales and rugged independence, consistently brought back accounts of the surreal region. Perhaps the most famous was Jim Bridger, a master storyteller whose descriptions included a mountain of glass, petrified forests with petrified birds singing petrified songs, and springs that would turn you white if you drank from them. Such was the strangeness of Yellowstone that the most reliable accounts sounded like the wildest exaggerations. The American public and the U.S. government simply didn't believe the land contained boiling rivers and erupting columns of water. It was considered a mythical wilderness, a place too strange to be factual. It took the age of scientific exploration and the fear of losing the American frontier to finally force a proper investigation. Chapter 3: The Expedition and the Birth of an Idea, 1870 to 1872. The 1870 Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition changed everything. It was a semi-official exploration led by Henry D. Washburn, Surveyor General of Montana, and including Nathaniel P. Langford, who would become the park's first superintendent, and a military escort led by Lieutenant Gustavus C. Doane. This group traveled through the park, meticulously documenting its thermal features and waterfalls. The sheer scale and beauty, the towering lower falls of the Yellowstone River dropping 308 feet into the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, stunned them. But it was the 1871 Hayden Geological Survey that sealed the park's fate. Led by geologist Ferdinand V. Hayden, this was a fully government-funded effort, and crucially, included two people who could capture the landscape for a skeptical nation: photographer William Henry Jackson and painter Thomas Moran. Jackson's clear, detailed photographs of Old Faithful and the Upper Geyser Basin, and Moran's vibrant, romantic paintings of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone were irrefutable proof. No longer could the phenomena be dismissed as trapper's gossip. The geysers were real, the colors were real, and the majesty was staggering. The turning point came at a campfire discussion near the junction of the Firehole and Gibbon Rivers. The group realized that this land was so unique, so spectacular, and so geologically volatile that it could not be carved up and sold off like typical public land. Local Montana judge Cornelius Hedges is famously credited with proposing the revolutionary idea that the land should be set apart as a great national park. Hayden quickly pushed the idea through Congress, arguing the land was worthless for agriculture and mineral extraction, but priceless for its natural wonders. On March 1, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act into law. Yellowstone became the world's first national park. It was an unprecedented act, an act of conservation for the public good, a new frontier in the American experiment. The legal language was clear. It was to be dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Chapter 4: The Army Years and the Struggle for Protection, 1872 to 1916. The creation of the park was a massive political achievement, but managing it was a far greater headache. Congress did not provide funding, staff, or enforceable laws. Nathaniel P. Langford, the first appointed superintendent, was unpaid and stretched thin, spending only a few weeks a year there. Poaching, vandalism, tourists broke pieces off the geyser cones as souvenirs, and squatting were rampant. The biggest early challenge was the wildlife. By the 1880s, market hunters were slaughtering the park's massive bison herds, leaving their carcasses to rot for hides. Without a way to effectively enforce the rules, the situation became desperate. In 1886, a frustrated U.S. Congress, having failed to fund the park's administration, handed control over to the U.S. Army. For the next 32 years, the Army ran Yellowstone. The troops of the 1st Cavalry, based out of Fort Yellowstone at Mammoth Hot Springs, were the park's de facto police force, engineers, and early rangers. It was the Army that established the first serious infrastructure. They built roads and bridges, created a system of rules that were actually enforced, and began to combat poachers in earnest. A critical moment occurred in 1894 with the capture of a poacher named Ed Howell, who was caught red-handed killing bison. Public outcry over Howell's trivial punishment led to the passage of the Lacey Act later that year, providing stiff penalties for poaching in the park and giving Yellowstone's managers the power to prosecute. This law was a major step in establishing the federal government's role in wildlife conservation. The Army's tenure solidified the concept of a protected area and stabilized the fragile wildlife populations, making way for the modern era of management. Chapter 5: The Automobile and the NPS, 1916-1960. The early 20th century brought two disruptive forces: the establishment of the National Park Service, NPS, in 1916, and the rise of the automobile. The NPS was created under the direction of Stephen Mather and his deputy, Horace Albright, who would later serve as Yellowstone's superintendent. Their goal was to unify the management of all federal parks, shifting control from the military to civilian professionals. In 1918, the Army finally handed full control of Yellowstone to the newly formed NPS. Mather and Albright were faced with a paradox: how to protect the park while simultaneously promoting it for visitor enjoyment. They saw the automobile as the key. They commissioned better roads, built the famous rustic-style Old Faithful Inn, and encouraged American families to drive to their national parks. Yellowstone quickly went from a multi-day journey by stagecoach to an accessible family vacation spot. The period also saw the rise of the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, during the Great Depression. CCC boys built trails, campgrounds, utility systems, and the beautiful stone and timber ranger stations that still dot the park, forever linking the park's infrastructure to one of America's most challenging economic era. This was also the era of the infamous bear feeding. Viewing bears was the main draw, and to ensure tourists got a show, garbage dumps were intentionally used as feeding sites. Visitors would line up along the bear feeding grounds to watch grizzly scavenge. Though seemingly good for tourism, it habituated the bears to human food, leading to hundreds of human-bear conflicts and ultimately the necessary but difficult move to stop the practice in the 1940s and 50s. Chapter 6: The Wildlife Saga, Restoration and Controversy. Yellowstone is arguably the most important ecological laboratory in the temperate world, and its wildlife management history is a complex reflection of changing American values. Bison. As a result of the Lacey Act and Army protection, the bison survived, though the herd was reduced to fewer than 50 animals in 1902. Today, the herd is the largest, oldest, and continuously wild population in the U.S. However, its movement out of the park during winter remains a huge political conflict, primarily due to rancher fears of the contagious disease brucellosis. Grizzly bears. Listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, the population has slowly recovered from a low point of around 136 animals to over 700 today. The fight over their delisting is ongoing and hotly debated, symbolizing the modern tension between species recovery and political control. The wolf reintroduction, 1995. This is perhaps the most significant conservation event in recent American history. Wolves were deliberately eradicated from the park by the 1920s due to public pressure from the livestock industry. Their absence had a massive trophic cascade effect. Elk populations exploded, overgrazing the riverside vegetation, willows and aspens. This led to a decline in beaver populations who rely on the willows and instability in stream banks. The 1995 reintroduction of Canadian gray wolves was highly controversial, but ecologically revolutionary. The wolves quickly established themselves and began to limit the elk population, allowing vegetation to recover, benefiting beavers, birds, and even changing the courses of rivers. Yellowstone became the world's most famous example of how a single predator can restore an entire ecosystem. Chapter 7: The Modern Marvel and Future Challenges. Today, Yellowstone National Park encompasses over 2.2 million acres, 3,472 square miles, draws millions of visitors annually, and sits at the forefront of the global conversation on conservation and climate change. The geothermal features, the geysers, hot springs, and fumaroles are not just beautiful, they are a constant, living reminder of the volatile nature of the park. Scientists meticulously monitor the ground uplift, seismic activity, and heat flow, continuously studying the caldera's activity. Old Faithful remains the undisputed star, a punctual geological clock that keeps a faithful schedule, reminding visitors of the wild power that lies beneath. The greatest challenge now is balancing access with preservation. The park's success is also its burden. Visitor numbers continue to soar, placing immense strain on infrastructure, staffing, and wildlife movement.
The threats of climate change, from increased fire severity to changes in snowpack and water levels, challenge the very integrity of the ecosystem. Yellowstone remains a paradox, a meticulously managed wilderness, a pristine national treasure accessible by paved roads and cell service, and a piece of land that is fundamentally, magnificently untamable. It is the only place where the ancient architecture of fire and ice, the history of America's frontier, and the ongoing, complex saga of wildlife conservation. It is, to this day, a place too strange to be truly believed until you stand there and see the steam rise from the earth, the elk graze unfazed, and the timeless, brilliant waters of the hot springs reflect the vast American sky.